Boy, YouTube sure has been kicking my ass lately. Normally content about war and conflict does well, but apparently YouTube doesn't want people to watch what they actually want to watch. I need to take this in a new direction, but how do I do this? I haven't bashed FDR in a while. I should fix that.
Sorry I'm late. I had to stop by the Wax Museum again and give the finger to FDR.
Let's talk about economic history. Wait, where are you going? I want to tell you a story about how President Franklin Delano Roosevelt fought a year-long war against the gold standard based on advice he received from a professor who was an expert in chicken feed. No, really. I've lost count of how many times I've said in videos or in real life that FDR was the most economically ignorant man to ever hold the presidency, and this ignorance made him susceptible to some batshit crazy ideas that no economist before or since has bought into. But before I tell you that, we're gonna need some background information. And before that information, I need to tell you about this video's sponsor, Established Titles. In the midst of FDR's war on gold, he banned private ownership of gold, justifying it as part of his war on the economic royalists. Well then, you can join me in claiming an ancient title that's sure to make FDR roll in his grave. There's an old Scottish custom where landowners can use the title of lord or laird. This video's sponsor, Established Titles, lets you buy a square foot of land in Scotland, allowing you to call yourself a lord. And you can have this placed on business cards, credit cards, plane tickets, and more. And they will send you a certificate with a unique plot number relating to a private estate in Eddleton, Scotland. The first 200 people to buy a plot through my link down in the description will get a 10% discount, and most of those plots will be adjacent to mine, so we can form our own little fiefdom. The holidays are coming up, and this would make a great last-minute gift for a friend or relative. And if giving the middle finger to a dead president isn't enough for you, when you buy an established title, you are also helping forest conservation in Scotland. They work with charities such as One Tree Planted and Trees for the Future. And for every plot sold, Established Titles plants a tree somewhere in the world. Thanks again to Established Titles for supporting Casual Historian and saving the environment in style. But for now, back to the history. The road to FDR's war on gold starts with World War I. As war spread across Europe, thousands of acres of farmland was obliterated by artillery shells and trenches, which put a strain on the food supply of the continent. They became dependent on food imported from the Western Hemisphere, and in particular, the United States. The demand for food and cotton in Europe caused prices to go up, which incentivized farmers in the US to invest in more land, labor, and equipment, with additional encouragement from the administration of President Woodrow Wilson. However, this created a bubble which popped after the guns fell silent in Europe. Farmers had become overinvested, producing too much, and now the price of agricultural goods fell sharply. With the profits from farming rapidly declining, the owners were having trouble paying back the loans and mortgages they took out to increase production in the first place. They were left with two options: either sell your farm, or double down by investing more into production and try to make up for the loss in sales. Since everyone was overinvested, there was too much production going on for everybody to make a profit. The logical answer would have been for everybody to produce less, but doing that would have required joint action by all farmers, which would have been a violation of antitrust laws. It was in everybody's interest that production go down, but in no individual's interest to bite the bullet and be the first one to do it. And so because of that, throughout the 1920s, farmers continued to be overinvested, and one of these overinvestments actually was in wells pulling up water from underground. And this became so widespread that it eventually became one of the major causes of the Dust Bowl. But that's a story for another time. By the time of the stock market crash in 1929, farmers had been in financial trouble for a decade, and when the banks started going under, it hit rural communities first. The banking cycle of farmers is different from other industries. They have to borrow money and time to hire labor to bring in the harvest in the fall, and sell said harvest in order to repay said loans. Many of these rural banks were strapped for cash due to the harvest season, and when the runs came, they didn't have the liquidity to handle it, so many went under. There's another path to FDR's war on gold that we need to discuss, and that's the path of gold and banking itself. The classical gold standard, as we imagine it, only existed for a few decades from the late 19th century up to World War I. If you want to know more about that, you can watch this older video I made on the subject. The short version is that central banks would regulate their supply of physical gold by adjusting their interest rates. When their supply was low, they would raise interest rates in order to encourage the inflow of gold into their country, and when supplies were high, they lowered interest rates in order to increase investment in industry. The international gold standard remained pretty stable when the basic rules were followed. But then, just like with farming, World War I happened. The governments of Europe increased spending to levels never before seen, levels of spending that couldn't be facilitated under the standard. So they all abandoned gold and ran their economies off of fiat currencies. But countries like the US, who were not yet in the war and far away from the actual fighting, stayed on the gold standard and demanded to be paid in gold for their goods and services. This resulted in tons of gold flowing from European banks to the US. On top of the regular market flows, European governments also sent their gold to bank vaults in New York for safekeeping. There was so much gold in the US that the Federal Reserve could keep its interest rates really low for a long time. If you want to know more about the Federal Reserve, I suggest you watch this previous video about its founding. Now, normally tons of extra money being pumped into the economy would cause inflation, but we didn't see that happening in the US because a lot of that money went towards increased production, which helped keep prices down. The places we didn't see inflation, though, was the stock market, and this was because Europe wasn't following the rules of the international gold standard. After the war, Europe's gold reserves were annihilated. Normally, this would be responded to with higher interest rates in order to attract more gold into the country, but the post-war recession made higher interest rates politically untenable. If you want to learn more about the monetary troubles of Europe in the 1920s, I suggest you watch this previous video I made about the world's first currency war. Wow, I've had like 3 previous video recommendations in just as many paragraphs. If you like economic history, give this video a like and subscribe to the channel and click the bell icon. It really helps. Anyways, the growing stock market bubble concerned the newly appointed chairman of the Federal Reserve, Roy Young. He foresaw a crash coming and wanted to slow the market down. Now, ideally, the European banks, especially France and Britain, would raise their interest rates, but due to political concerns, they weren't. So Young took it upon himself to do so, which was the wrong decision at the wrong time. In 1928, he began to raise interest rates to slow down the velocity of money. Unfortunately, this reduced the amount of cash available in smaller local banks across the US. When your supply of gold is high, you keep interest rates low in order to encourage borrowing, which adds liquidity to the market. And the supply of gold in the Federal Reserve and the US Treasury was ridiculously high in the late 1920s and early 1930s. It was more than sufficient to cover all the gold exchanges and then some. But the crash happened and banks started going under. Businesses, including farms, couldn't get loans due to the restrictionist monetary policy of Roy Young. And between 1929 and 1933, there were several waves of bank runs. The ones that concern this video started in the latter half of 1932. The Democrats took control of Congress after the 1930 midterms, and were much more inclined to federal intervention than the Republican Congress before them. In January of 1932, they established the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, or RFC, which would be used to provide liquidity to struggling banks in the US. But 6 months later, Congress passed a law requiring the RFC to publicly disclose, on a monthly basis, the names of banks that had received these emergency loans. Now, this was done with the best of intentions. Unfortunately, seeing a bank's name on this caused panic in the market and made them seen as weak. And it definitely caused panic amongst that bank's depositors, who would then rush down to the bank to pull out their money before it went under, which subsequently caused it to go under. These bank runs discouraged many banks who needed loans to ensure their liquidity to not take them. State governments tried to stop the bank runs themselves by enacting statewide bank holidays, which prohibited bank transactions. This created a respite for the banks in that state, but it caused shortages to happen in banks in neighboring states, who would borrow money from other banks to ensure their own liquidity. During the 1932 presidential campaign, a pair of FDR supporters put together a team of advisors to help FDR write his speeches and provide him with talking points. This team would become known as the Brains Trust, and it consisted entirely of academics with no experience in the economy or government. Only one of them was an economist, but he wasn't a macroeconomist, but rather an expert in what we today would call scientific management. The first was Raymond Moley, a law professor at Columbia University who served as FDR's advisor when he was governor of New York. He is credited with drafting the Forgotten Man speech and came up with the term New Deal to refer to FDR's policy agenda. Then there was Adolph A. Burrell Jr. He was also a professor at Columbia and had worked for Justice Brandeis's law firm, where he acquired a strong disgust for big banks, trusts, and financiers. However, instead of advocating breaking them up, he preferred to have them heavily regulated. His biggest claim to fame would be a book he co-authored in 1932 about corporate power, which was one of the first explorations of the principal agent problem. The only economist amongst the big three brain trusters was Rexford Tugwell, yet another professor at Columbia University. He had a PhD in economics and he was a big fan of Soviet-style central planning, and would be involved in much of the New Deal's regulatory operations. But as alluded to before, Tugwell was not a macroeconomist, but a management specialist. He believed in 1932 that the US economy had reached peak development, and that there was no more room for further economic growth. And because the economy had reached its material limits, those industries should be nationalized by the government. During his teaching career, Tugwell was never allowed to teach a class above undergrad. However, he often compared talking to FDR to teaching an Econ 101 class to college freshmen. Now, all of these guys would bear some responsibility for the slew of bad New Deal policies, but none of them were responsible for FDR's war on gold. That would be a fourth, Columbia professor George F. Warren Jr. Warren is sometimes generously referred to as an agricultural economist, but in reality, he was just an expert in animal feed. Well, in 1921, he co-authored a book called Prices, which argued that there was a direct connection between the value of gold and the price of agricultural goods, and that if you could raise the value of gold, the price of agricultural goods would also rise. Well, back in the 1920s and 30s, farmers were a big, influential faction within the Democratic Party, much more so than today, and there was nothing farmers wanted more than higher commodity prices. Well, during the 1932 campaign, Roosevelt and the Brain Trust came across Warren's book, and FDR seemed to take a liking to it, or at least take a liking to its conclusions, and began to formulate a policy of how to raise the price of gold by devaluing the US dollar. But FDR didn't mention this policy during the campaign. In fact, when he was asked questions on monetary policy, he said the exact opposite, that he supported a strong gold-backed dollar, as most Democratic presidential candidates had said for decades. The reason for this? Well, that's because Warren was a crank. Nobody at the time took this idea seriously, and even fewer do today. It had fewer supporters back in the 1930s than modern monetary theory does today. And even more evidence of how much the administration knew this guy was nuts is that they gave him an office in the Commerce Department, but he wasn't listed as being in that office. They didn't list his phone number, and he wasn't allowed to keep any files in that office in case somebody wandered by and found his crazy rantings. But the Roosevelt campaign wasn't able to keep his dollar devaluation policy secret forever. In early January 1933, rumors of an impending devaluation triggered bank runs in the Midwest from depositors who were afraid they wouldn't be able to convert their paper dollars back into gold under the incoming administration. This was compounded by a House resolution that month which mandated that the RFC disclose all the banks that had received loans prior to the law from July. Once again, this sparked panics and bank runs. State governors called their own bank holidays, but they could only delay the inevitable. FDR was sworn in as president on March 4th, 1933, and on March 6th, he proclaimed a banking holiday in which he suspended gold redemptions and exports. The legality of this move was questionable, having been based on the Trading with the Enemies Act from 1917. So on March 9th, Congress passed the Emergency Banking Act. Congress also passed the Gold Reserve Act, which gave the Secretary of the Treasury the authority to compel private citizens to sell their gold to the Federal Reserve. On March 10th, FDR issued Executive Order 6073, which forbade the movement of gold without the approval of the Secretary of the Treasury. And on April 5th, he issued Executive Order 6012, the confiscation of privately held gold. Refusal to comply by May 1st could result in a fine of $10,000, which, adjusted for inflation, would be nearly $250,000, and up to 10 years in prison. At the time, most observers believed that this was merely a temporary measure in order to stabilize the banking system. And when asked, FDR denied that he was planning to go off the gold standard. Now, all of this was happening at the same time an international conference was being planned in London. In 1932, President Hoover came to the conclusion that the Depression was a product of international monetary malfeasance. So he began organizing a conference of all the major gold standard countries to meet in London to hammer out a new international gold standard in order to stabilize exchange rates. Hoover was actually onto something, considering that it was Britain and France's refusal to raise their interest rates that motivated Roy Young to tighten America's own monetary policy. But like everything else, FDR would inherit the planning for this conference as well. But because FDR was planning on going off the gold standard and devaluing the dollar, he didn't have much need for a conference restoring the gold standard. The State Department, under the leadership of Cordell Hull, wanted to reframe the conference to be about free trade, and the Treasury Department, who was given control of the US delegation, wanted to reframe it to be about internationalizing the New Deal. This resulted in the conferences being a huge, confuddled mess. Just days before the conference was to meet, FDR officially took the US off the gold standard, which made it impossible to get any agreement made in London. What made it worse is that while the US delegation was on the boat headed home, FDR held a press conference where he derided the intention of the conference, which soured relations with the leaders of Europe toward Roosevelt. The day he was planning to announce the abandonment of the gold standard, he called his cabinet into the White House where he said, "Congratulate me." Cordell Hull, an old-fashioned bourbon Democrat who believed in a strong currency, reacted very negatively to this, and was apparently not told about the decision before it was made. FDR is said to have pulled a $10 bill from his pocket, examined it, and pointed out that it was from the Federal Reserve Bank of Tennessee, Hull's home state. He then said to Hull, "How do I know it's any good? Only the fact that I think it is makes it so." There was another problem with going off the gold standard, that being contract law. So back in the day of the gold standard, a gold clause in a contract would say that any monetary obligation could be fulfilled with either dollars or the equivalent value in gold. But with gold confiscated, the federal government made the contracts unfulfillable, which was most likely also unconstitutional. So in June 1933, Congress passed another law abrogating all gold clauses in both public and private contracts. By summer, the federal government owned most of the gold in the United States, detached the dollar from said gold, and started pumping the economy full of money to try and drive up prices. But this wasn't working, or at least not much. So in August of 1933, Professor Warren began telling FDR and Henry Morgenthau Jr. that the Treasury and Federal Reserve should start buying up more gold in order to drive the price up, which, he asserted, would also drive up the value of agricultural commodities. The gold purchase policy, indeed, had no really convincing exact basis in theory or in fact. Warren's statistics proved everything except his specific conclusions. The more sophisticated economists among Roosevelt's advisors considered Warren's claims absurd. For Roosevelt, the Warren plan had one decisive advantage. It freed him from the intolerable necessity of sitting by and doing nothing while prices fell. On August 29th, FDR would sign Executive Order 6261, which mandated all gold mines in the US sell their gold to the US Treasury, and at prices determined by the Treasury. However, Undersecretary of the Treasury, Dean Acheson, believed that this policy was illegal, since the Gold Standard Act had set the value of gold to $20.67 an ounce, and was legally the only price at which the Treasury or the Fed could purchase it at, while FDR and Warren wanted to buy them at a higher value in order to drive up the commodity prices. The president was not satisfied. What he wanted, he indicated, was a method of getting something done, not a statement that it was impossible. Henry Morgenthau devised a means, he believed, circumvented the gold statute. He ordered the Reconstruction Finance Corporation to purchase gold and then use the gold as collateral to take out loans, which it could then lend out. They then combined this with a statute dating back to the American Civil War, which allowed the government to buy gold at changing prices. Acheson opposed this, citing that this statute had been supplanted by the Gold Standard Act. At an October 19th meeting, FDR told the Treasury staff that the gold buying policy was legal. Acheson then asked if he could get an order in writing, to which the president just responded, "I say it is legal." Acheson planned to resign, but he was convinced to stay on in order to prevent even worse policies. But it didn't take long for his feelings about the gold buying policy to be leaked to the media. FDR got so angry that he wrote a letter to Acheson demanding that he resign. But before he could receive the letter, FDR had told a reporter that Acheson had resigned, which is how he discovered that he had been fired. The finance community was broadly opposed to the policy. One of his advisors, Paul Warburg, who was one of the founders of the Federal Reserve, had voiced his disagreement with the administration. In fact, most of his advisors did, including his brain trust. His former mentor, Al Smith, also criticized the administration for it. FDR, with his incessant campaign against economic royalists, came to believe that the bankers were conspiring with the Republicans to hamper economic recovery so the GOP could retake power and restore the gold standard. Every morning, FDR would meet with Morgenthau and the head of the RFC and discuss what the value of gold should be. The precise value was not considered important, so long as it was higher than before. If anybody ever knew how we really set the gold prices through a combination of lucky numbers, etc., I think they would be really frightened. Despite the gold buying, farm commodity prices fell. FDR demanded an answer from Warren in November of 1933, to which his response was to buy even more gold from overseas. This worried foreign bankers in Britain and France, seeing America as devaluing its currency against theirs, which resulted in Britain and France retaliating with further devaluations of their own. Once again, see my video about the world's first currency war. Despite the policy not working, farmers seemed content that the president was publicly doing something about their plight. New York Fed Chairman George Harrison warned FDR that the dollar devaluation was hammering the market for US Treasury bonds. Keynes, who was supportive of FDR's jobs programs, criticized the obsession with gold. Even organized labor started turning against him because dollar devaluation harmed the purchasing power of industrial workers. In January 1934, Congress passed the Gold Reserve Act, after which the president proclaimed the price of gold to be $35 an ounce. During his State of the Union address in 1934, he defended gold confiscation, but instead of using Warren's theory, he justified it by claiming that he was trying to stabilize the value of the dollar, despite spending the whole previous year actively destabilizing it. The gold policies would result in 3 Supreme Court cases. FDR feared that he might lose, so he told his new Treasury Secretary, Henry Morgenthau Jr., to try and keep the markets confused until the Supreme Court decided the gold case, so that even if the court decided against him, there would be popular demand for him to do something about the economic chaos. Morgenthau didn't like the idea. Mr. President, you know how difficult it is to get this country out of a depression, and if we let the financial markets of this country become frightened for the next month, it may take us 8 months to recover the lost ground. Morgenthau had not agreed to the plan, but Roosevelt eventually dropped it. He would narrowly win his cases 5-4. The progressive historian William Leuchtenberg said, "Gold buying was one of the most ill-considered moves Roosevelt ever made." And another progressive historian, Arthur Schlesinger Jr., said, "The action he took was, on the whole, ineffectual, and it was based on a shallow and incorrect thesis." Thanks again to Established Titles for sponsoring this video. The first 200 to buy a plot through my link down in the description will get a 10% discount and have their plots adjacent to mine. I also want to thank my patrons for helping make this video possible. Their support allows me to weather any kind of inconvenient algorithm storm that YouTube may be sending us through. And I of course want to thank my newest patron, Mikhail Poda, for joining the Casual Historian Patreon. Members of the Casual Historian Patreon get access to a patrons-only Discord server, where I talk with you guys about what I'm working on and the progress of videos and future video topics. If you're interested in becoming a patron yourself, then go to patreon.com/casualhistorian to learn more. And if you got some value out of this video, then I suggest you give it a like, share it, and subscribe to the channel and click the bell icon to make sure you don't miss future videos when they come out. Thanks for watching, and I will see you next time.